In this video, I present to you a detailed and well-explained summary of the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad to help you enhance your financial literacy and gain the full benefits of the book. Follow along to start increasing your wealth. The book Rich Dad, Poor Dad begins with a simple yet profound idea. Wealth is a mindset, and poverty is a mindset. This is the key takeaway you will get after reading the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. That's why you find people who start from nothing and go on to make millions, while others inherit great fortunes but end up broke or drowning in debt. Here comes a comparison between the rich mindset and the poor mindset, illustrated through a story told by the author Robert Kiyosaki. I had two fathers, one rich and one poor. From this story, the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad begins. One of them had the highest academic degrees, while the other never finished middle school. Both worked hard and succeeded in their respective fields. However, the first struggled financially throughout his life and passed away, leaving behind debts that burdened his family. Meanwhile, the other accumulated millions and left behind a great fortune, charitable foundations, and places of worship. The striking difference between them was that, although both emphasized the importance of education, the first insisted on academic education alone, while the other emphasized life lessons along with academic education. Both fathers gave him advice, but their advice was vastly different. This created a conflict in his mind, pushing him to reflect deeply on what they were telling him. One father would say, "Money is the root of all evil." The other would say, "The lack of money and poverty are the root of all evil." One kept saying, "I can't do that," while the other asked, "How can I do that?" These contrasting ideas kept running through the boy's mind, making him analyze and compare the perspectives of both fathers. One father advised, "Study hard so you can find prestigious company to work for." The other said, "Study hard so you can find prestigious company to buy." The first father urged him, "Stay in your comfort zone," while the other encouraged him, "Learn to manage risk." These differences that filled his mind made him realize that his poor father was poor because of his way of thinking and his view of money as something unimportant. Likewise, his rich father was wealthy because of his mindset and his perception of money as something essential and significant in life. At that moment, he understood that striving for a wealthy life is a right and not a flaw. It is a pursuit of anyone who sets this goal as their ambition. Bankruptcy is merely a temporary phase in life that can be overcome, whereas poverty is a way of thinking that condemns you to eternal suffering. The rich dad had 6 simple lessons, guiding principles that help navigate the path to wealth, regardless of the ever-changing world. I will explain them all in this article, a summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Lesson 1 from the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. The rich don't work for money. Robert asked his father, "How can I become rich?" Which is probably the same question you asked yourself when you started reading the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. His father looked at him, thought for a moment, and then said, "If you want to be rich, you must learn how to create money. And to do that, you need to use your mind." Determined to follow his father's advice, the boy went to his best friend, Mike, and proposed that they become business partners and learn how to make money together. And so, their first business venture began. The two boys started collecting empty metal cans from their neighbors. After gathering a large enough quantity, they attempted to melt the metal to extract nickel and mold it into counterfeit coins. However, their project ended the same day they completed it when Robert's father told them that what they were doing was illegal and that they couldn't create money this way. If they truly wanted an answer, they had to go to Mike's father and learn from him instead. The boys went to Mike's father, who offered them a job under him to teach them how to build wealth. He gave them only 10 seconds to accept his offer, because a wealthy person cannot achieve riches if they hesitate and struggle to make decisions. Without delay, the boys accepted the offer, and thus their learning journey began. Their job was simple: sorting and cleaning cans for 3 hours every Saturday at Mike's father's store. They were paid only 10 cents per hour, the meager wage given by the rich dad. From the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Every week, Robert would take his small wage and use it to buy 3 children's magazines. By the middle of the week, he would find himself broke, having read all of them. He would then wait impatiently for Saturday to arrive. So he could go back to work without learning anything new and for a meager wage. Frustrated, Robert told his father about what was happening. His father got angry, and Robert, reflecting that anger, rushed to Mike's house and told him that his father had to raise his pay, or he would quit the job. Mike smiled and told him that his father had expected Robert to say this at some point, and that he wanted to meet him the following Saturday to discuss the matter. When the day of the meeting arrived, Robert was burning with frustration. After 4 weeks of hard work, he now stood once again at the door of Mike's father's office, his mind telling him that he had been exploited for an entire month for a meager wage, without learning anything about making money. The moment Robert entered the office, he burst into tears, pouring out all his frustrations while Mike's father listened calmly. Once Robert finished speaking, Mike's father told him to stop blaming others and instead look within himself for possible solutions. Robert responded that his only options were either to get a raise or quit the job. Mike's father replied that Robert was thinking like every employee who had ever worked for him. At some point in their careers, they decide their salary isn't worth the effort. They start complaining, and they either quit their job in search of another, only complain about it later as well, or they accept their reality and continue working just to earn money. Robert then asked, "So what's the solution?" Mike's father explained that chasing jobs and spending a lifetime working for money is what keeps people stuck in debt and poverty forever. This is where the first lesson from Rich Dad, Poor Dad becomes clear. The rich don't work for money. Money works for them. Robert understood the first lesson, and at that moment, Mike's father made him a new offer. He would allow Robert to work at the store for 3 hours every Saturday, but without any pay. Robert smiled and accepted the offer, as did his friend Mike. For the next 3 weeks, the boys continued working without any wages. Then, they finally met with Mike's father again. He invited them to walk with him, and along the way, he bought them ice cream. They arrived at a public park, sat on a bench, and Mike's father began speaking. He asked them how they felt about working without pay. And at that moment, the boys knew another important lesson was coming. Mike's father then offered them 25 cents per hour for their work at the store. The boys refused, knowing this was a trap. He then increased the offer to $1 per hour. The agreement between the rich dad, Robert, and Mike. From the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Robert felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was a huge amount of money for a child at that time. Despite his excitement, he once again refused the offer, along with his friend Mike. Mike's father smirked slyly and made them one final offer, one that almost made their hearts leap with joy. $5 per hour. This was an irresistible offer, even for an adult, let alone a 9-year-old child. Despite the dreamy visions forming in Robert's mind, he suddenly realized his rich dad's true lesson. So, he firmly refused, and Mike did the same. At that moment, the rich dad began explaining the trap of a traditional job and how most people fall into it due to 2 primary emotions: desire and fear. Desire for owning the best and shiniest things. Fear of losing those things once they have them. The difference between the rich and the poor lies in how they respond to these emotions. The poor react by searching for a job and panicking at the thought of not having one. The rich react by thinking and searching for ways to make money work for them. Since the boys had fully understood the first lesson, their young minds started working on a plan to apply it in real life. Their first business venture? They asked for permission to use some free magazines that couldn't be sold in the store. Then, they set up a small library for kids under the staircase at home. They neatly arranged the magazines and offered any child a chance to read as much as they wanted for 2 hours for just 10 cents. And so, their business started generating a lot of money. Robert and Mike's business became very profitable. They even hired Mike's younger sister to be the librarian in their absence, paying her $1 per week. This allowed them to earn $9 per week without working at all. Lesson 2 from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Why is financial education important? The rich buy assets, the poor buy liabilities. This single sentence summarizes the second lesson from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Poor people believe that houses and cars are assets because they own them. Rich people understand that real assets generate money, while liabilities drain money from their pockets. This principle came to Robert's mind when he wanted to buy a car for his wife after making a decent amount of money. before making the purchase. He remembered his rich dad's lesson: the rich buy assets, the poor buy liabilities. He realized that a car is a liability. It wouldn't make him money and would require ongoing expenses. Instead of buying the car immediately, he invested his money in an asset. For years later, that asset had generated enough money for him to invest in more assets and also buy the car without financial strain. Schools don't teach this. Traditional schools prepare students to become employees who spend their paychecks on liabilities. They don't teach financial literacy, the ability to build assets that generate income without actively working for it. Buying a house isn't necessarily bad, but a wealthy person would first invest in an asset that generates passive income. This way, the income from that asset can cover the house payments, instead of spending their entire salary and getting trapped in the endless cycle of job, salary, expenses, no financial growth. Lesson 3 from Rich Dad, Poor Dad: mind your own business. To understand this lesson, let's look at a story from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. One day, Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, was invited to give a lecture to MBA students at the University of Texas at Austin. After his lecture, he joined some students at a bar where they enjoyed casual conversation. At one point, Kroc asked the students a question: "Do you know what business I'm in?" The students laughed because they thought he was joking. Kroc asked again, "Does anyone know my real business?" One student confidently answered, "Everyone knows you run McDonald's restaurants." Kroc laughed and said, "No, my profession is running McDonald's, but my business is real estate." Interesting fact. This isn't from Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but it's an important financial lesson. The difference between a job and a business. A job is a skill you learn and practice to make money. A business is what you do based on your personal interests and strengths. It's the key to wealth. This lesson stayed in Robert's mind because his rich dad had taught him this since childhood. His rich dad always told him, focus on your own business alongside your profession. Following this advice led to his own business. By following this principle, Robert was able to start his own company in a field he was passionate about, rather than spending his entire life in a job he didn't care about, only working for a paycheck at the end of each month. And this is essentially the core message of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Lesson 4 from Rich Dad, Poor Dad: the history of taxes and corporate power. This lesson can be summarized by what Robert calls the Robin Hood tax system, taking money from the extremely rich and giving it to the poor. At first, this sounded great to many people. When tax laws were introduced, governments promoted them as a way to fund public needs by taxing the wealthy. People supported this idea, believing it would create social justice. But what they didn't realize was that handling money requires financial intelligence. Those who studied how taxes worked and gained financial education found many legal ways to build wealth while avoiding high taxes. The tax burden shifted over time. Over the years, the middle class ended up paying more in taxes than the rich. The corporate ladder became a tax trap. With every promotion and pay raise, employees fell into higher tax brackets, losing more money than they gained. Meanwhile, the wealthy studied tax laws and used financial intelligence to protect and grow their wealth. For example, in the United States, there's a tax loophole that allows property investors to avoid capital gains taxes if they reinvest in a more expensive property. This saves investors up to 35% in taxes, allowing them to grow their assets instead of losing money to taxation. The rich constantly think this way, finding legal ways to keep their money working for them. Financial intelligence, academic education. This is one of the key lessons from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Financial education is far more valuable than academic education. A college degree may help you get a job, but financial intelligence helps you build wealth, avoid financial pitfalls, and create lasting financial freedom. With strong financial knowledge, your path to wealth becomes smoother and the obstacles you face become less significant. Lesson 5 from the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad: the rich create ways to make money. Explanation: this lesson from the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad will be easier when I tell you the following situation. It happened during a break Robert was taking from writing while watching some TV programs. And by chance, he watched two programs with completely opposite ideas. The first program, it was about Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the landline phone. When the demand for his new invention increased and his small company couldn't keep up, he went to a large company, Western Union, and asked them to buy his patenting company so he could meet the growing demand for his invention. However, the giant company rejected his request. Now, his invention is a foundation for some of the greatest wealth of the 21st century, the second program. It was a news segment about an organization cutting down its size, which led to the dismissal of a significant number of employees. These workers, angered by the unfair treatment, gathered outside the company's door to protest. Among them was a man, 45 years old, with his wife and 2 children, begging the guards to let him speak with the company owners, as his life would be ruined if he lost his job. Where is the contradiction in these 2 scenes? Let me explain. The first program tells the story of someone who had an idea that could make him money. The second program tells the story of someone who tied his life to a company that could collapse at any moment, without warning. This is a fundamental difference between the rich and the poor. The poor wait for opportunities to knock on their door, while the rich create opportunities from nothing. The poor work for money, while the rich invent ways to get it. Here's a simple example of applying this idea. Robert tells a small story from the early 1990s, when the economy was in a very tough situation. At that time, Robert was looking for an opportunity to buy real estate between bankruptcies and courts. He found someone who wanted to sell his house for about a quarter of its original price because he needed to pay off his debts quickly. At that time, Robert borrowed some money from a friend, promising a small interest if he could return it in 90 days. He spent the amount on a lawyer and an advertisement for the house on sale. He listed the house for $60,000, emphasizing that its value was $75,000, which attracted a lot of interest from potential buyers. Robert quickly sold the house, paid the original homeowner $20,000, returned the money he borrowed from his friend, and made a big profit without spending much. Even during that recession, Robert was able to make significant profits because of his way of thinking and his ability to create methods to make money. This is the essence of Lesson 5 from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Even if you have nothing, you can start and work hard to achieve great goals. Meanwhile, the poor will continue to wait for things to improve, opportunities to increase, and money to fall from the sky before they start. And they will never start. Based on the first lesson, which states that the wealthy do not work for money, it makes sense that the final lesson emphasizes the importance of seeing work as an opportunity for learning and development, not just as a means of earning money. This may be one of the most important lessons in the summary of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. This is what the rich dad taught Robert, who understood that a person must learn something from everything, and that wealth cannot be achieved by someone who does not want to learn. There are things that people may not value because they don't fall within the prestigious academic fields recognized by society, such as sales and business systems, which might actually be the dividing line between poverty and wealth. As an example, Robert would always ask his students if anyone could make a better hamburger than McDonald's, and most of them would raise their hands. He would then ask them why they couldn't earn more money than McDonald's if they could make a better hamburger. The answer is simple. They lack business systems. And this is the point where the wealthy outperform the poor. The wealthy pay attention to everything related to presentation, sales, and trade, and they excel at making sales and marketing. They do not belittle any knowledge or information that can help them step out of their specialized field and allow them to dive into many successes, while the poor remain stuck in their narrow specialization. This is exactly what happened with the journalist who sought Robert's advice about her books, which were not popular despite her having high academic qualifications that could have made her one of the best authors. Robert advised her to take a sales course, but she was not happy with the suggestion and found it strange and outside of her specialization. She refused to follow his advice, even though he was a best-selling author, simply because the field was outside of her expertise, and she saw no benefit in it. Learning things outside of your specialization does not mean abandoning your specific goal. It means reaching your goal more effectively and gaining an additional advantage that others with a poor mindset don't have.